In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Meadowbrook Estates, life was supposed to be perfect. The houses were neat, the lawns were manicured, and everything had its place. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect suburb lay a simmering tension between the residents and the Homeowners Association, HOA. For years, the HOA had been the ultimate authority, dictating rules about mailbox colors, garden decorations, and even the type of curtains people could hang in their windows. Most folks just went along with it, too afraid to rock the boat. But not everyone. Enter Evan Carter, a man who wasn't cut from the same cloth as most of his neighbors. Evan wasn't your typical suburban homeowner. He didn't care much for designer furniture or fancy landscaping. What he cared about was freedom, the freedom to live life on his own terms. When Evan bought his property on the edge of Meadowbrook Estates, he saw it as more than just another house. To him, it was a blank canvas where he could build his dream homestead. He imagined wide-open spaces, livestock grazing peacefully, and rows of vegetables growing under the sun. It was a vision straight out of a country magazine, but here in Meadowbrook, it felt like a rebellion waiting to happen. Evan got to work, right away. One of the first things he did was install a sturdy wooden fence around his land. It wasn't anything fancy, just simple, strong posts and planks. But it served its purpose. The fence kept his cows safe and gave him some privacy. To Evan, it was practical and necessary, but to the HOA, it was an eyesore. They called it out of character for the neighborhood. A letter arrived in Evan's mailbox a few weeks later, informing him that his fence violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. Not only that, they slapped him with a hefty fine and demanded he replace it with something more suitable. At first, Evan thought it was a joke. Replace his perfectly good fence for what? Something that looked like everyone else's cookie-cutter picket fences? He shook his head, folded the letter, and tossed it aside. Surely they'd see reason if he explained how important the fence was for his ranch. So, Evan sent them a polite email explaining his situation. He told them about his plans for the land, his love for farming, and why the fence was essential for keeping his animals secure. But the HOA didn't budge. In fact, they doubled down. Another letter came, this time with a sterner tone. They warned Evan that if he didn't comply within 30 days, they'd take legal action. That's when the frustration set in. Evan wasn't the kind of guy to back down easily. He prided himself on standing up for what he believed in, and this felt personal. Why should he have to conform to someone else's idea of beauty when his fence was functional and harmless? As the days passed, Evan found himself thinking about the situation constantly. He couldn't understand why the HOA cared so much about a fence. Was it really such a big deal? Didn't they have better things to worry about? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about a piece of wood anymore. It was about control. The HOA wanted to dictate every aspect of life in Meadowbrook, and Evan wasn't about to let them win. One evening, after a long day of tending to his cattle, Evan sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the fence. His mind raced with possibilities. There had to be a way to fight back, to show the HOA that they couldn't push him around. But how? He knew he couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, and he didn't want to move either. This was his home now, his sanctuary. Then an idea began to form, a risky, bold, and slightly mischievous plan. What if he turned the tables on the HOA? What if he used their own rules against them? Evan leaned forward, placing his coffee mug on the railing. His lips curled into a sly smile as the pieces started falling into place. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, he'd give them a game they'd never forget. And little did they know, their prized common area, an empty lot used for picnics and holiday gatherings, was about to become the center of attention in ways no one could have predicted. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about sending a message. It was about standing up for himself and maybe teaching the entire neighborhood a lesson about fairness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over his land, Evan felt a spark of determination ignite within him. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Evan wasn't the kind of person to sit back and let things happen to him. When he got angry, he didn't just stew in silence. He acted, and this time his anger was bubbling over like a pot left too long on the stove. The HOA had drawn a line, in the sand, and Evan was determined to figure out how to cross it without getting burned. But before he could strike back, he needed to arm himself with knowledge. So he did what any smart, resourceful person would do. He hit the books, or rather the internet. For hours each night, Evan pored over local zoning laws, municipal codes, and anything else he could find that might give him an edge. At first, it felt overwhelming. There were so many rules, exceptions, and fine print clauses that it seemed impossible to make sense of it all. But Evan had always been the kind of guy who thrived under pressure. He reminded himself why he was doing this, not just for his fence, but for the principle of the thing. He wasn't going to let some faceless committee tell him how to live on his own land. Then, one evening while scrolling through pages of legal jargon, something caught his eye. A small, seemingly insignificant sentence buried deep in the town's zoning regulations. It mentioned that certain areas could be rezoned for agricultural purposes if they failed to meet environmental standards, or if adjacent property owners petitioned for it. Evan read it again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. Agricultural purposes, that sounded promising. His mind began racing with possibilities. The more Evan thought about it, the more he realized this little clause could be his golden ticket. If the HOA wanted to nitpick about his fence, maybe it was time to show them what real agricultural activities looked like. What if he petitioned to rezone part of their precious common area, the empty lot where families held picnics and kids played soccer, into something far less glamorous? Something like livestock manure storage. At first, the idea made him chuckle. Livestock manure storage. Just saying it out loud in his head brought a grin to his face. It was absurd, ridiculous even, but also strangely brilliant. Sure, it might sound extreme, but wasn't that the point? The HOA had forced his hand by refusing to budge on the fence issue. Now it was his turn to push back, and push hard. If they wanted to play games, he'd show them exactly how far those games could go. But Evan knew he couldn't just waltz into City Hall and demand they rezone the land without a solid plan. This wasn't about revenge. It was about strategy. He spent the next few days researching everything he could about manure management, composting, and sustainable farming practices. He wanted to make sure his proposal wouldn't just hold up legally, but also offer some kind of benefit to the community, even if it was buried under layers of irony. He learned that properly managed manure could actually serve a purpose. It could be turned into nutrient-rich compost, which was great for gardens and farms. Of course, Evan didn't have any illusions about convincing his neighbors to embrace piles of cow dung in their backyard. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to send a message, to shake things up enough to make the HOA realize they couldn't treat people however they pleased. With his newfound knowledge, Evan started drafting his petition. He kept it professional, sticking to facts and figures, but there was no denying the underlying tone of defiance. He argued that the HOA's refusal to accommodate his ranch-style living was hypocritical, especially when the neighborhood sat on prime land that could support eco-friendly initiatives. By rezoning the common area, he claimed, Meadowbrook Estates would be taking a step toward sustainability, a buzzword that everyone loved these days. As he worked on the petition late into the night, Evan couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. On one hand, he was proud of himself for finding such a clever loophole. On the other hand, he knew this was risky business. People didn't take kindly to having their picnic spots threatened by the prospect of animal waste. Still, he reminded himself that this wasn't personal. It was about standing up for what was fair. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, he'd match them, move for move. Once the petition was ready, Evan printed it out and headed to City Hall early the next morning. As he handed it over to the clerk behind the counter, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Whether or not his request was granted, he'd already won in a way. He'd shown the HOA that he wasn't someone to be pushed around. And as word of his bold move spread through Meadowbrook, he knew the battle was only beginning. Some of his neighbors were shocked when they heard about it. Others thought it was hilarious. A few even secretly admired Evan's guts. No matter what anyone said, though, one thing was clear. Evan Carter had officially become the talk of the town, and whether people liked it or not, they were about to see just how far he was willing to go to protect his way of life. News travels fast in a small community like Meadowbrook Estates. By the time Evan submitted his petition to City Hall, whispers about his plan were already rippling through the neighborhood. It started with a few curious glances and hushed conversations at the grocery store. Then came the gossip chains, neighbors talking over coffee, parents chatting during school drop-offs, and friends texting late into the night. Before long, everyone knew what Evan was up to. He wanted to turn part of the HOA's beloved common area into livestock manure storage. At first, most people thought it was a joke. Who would seriously suggest something like that? But as more details emerged, the reality sank in. This wasn't just idle talk. Evan had filed an official petition, complete with legal arguments and environmental justifications. The idea of piles of cow dung sitting where kids once played soccer or families hosted summer barbecues felt surreal, and for many, deeply unsettling. The reaction from the community was mixed. Some folks admired Evan's boldness. They saw him as a modern-day underdog standing up to the HOA's iron grip. Good for him, one neighbor muttered during a morning jog. Maybe this will finally teach them not to mess with people's lives. Others agreed, nodding along whenever the topic came up. These residents had long resented the HOA's strict rules but never dared to challenge them. Now watching Evan take a stand gave them a sense of hope, or at least entertainment. But not everyone was amused. Many homeowners were horrified at the prospect of having manure storage so close to their homes. "It's disgusting," one woman complained during a book club meeting. "What if the smell gets everywhere? What if flies invade our backyards?" Her concerns echoed throughout the community. Parents worried about their children playing near the site, while others fretted about property values plummeting. For some, the mere thought of manure made their skin crawl. The HOA scrambled to respond. Within days, they called an emergency meeting to address the growing panic. Flyers went out across the neighborhood, urging residents to attend and voice their opinions. The message was clear. We need to stop this before it ruins Meadowbrook. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, filled with anxious faces. Some brought notebooks and pens ready to take notes. Others clenched their fists, determined to fight back against Evan's proposal. When the meeting began, the tension in the air was palpable. The HOA president stood at the front of the room, looking unusually flustered. After a brief introduction, she opened the floor for discussion. Hands shot up immediately, each person eager to share their thoughts. One man spoke first, his voice trembling with frustration. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. "Who does this guy think he is, trying to ruin our neighborhood? We pay good money to live here, and now we're supposed to put up with that." He gestured wildly, toward the parking lot, as if the offending manure piles were already there. Another resident chimed in, her tone calmer but equally firm. "I understand that he's upset about his fence, but this isn't the answer. There has to be a better way to resolve this without turning our community upside down." Not everyone sided with the HOA, though. A young couple who lived 2 streets away raised their hands hesitantly. When called upon, the husband cleared his throat and said, "Look, I don't love the idea of manure storage either, but maybe we should ask ourselves why this is happening in the first place. The HOA fined him for something that seems harmless to me. Maybe if they'd been more flexible, none of this would have happened." His words sparked murmurs of agreement from a few corners of the room. Another neighbor added, "Honestly, I'm tired of all these rules. Every time you turn around, there's another fine or warning. If anything, this whole situation shows how unreasonable things have gotten around here." As the debate raged on, Evan sat quietly in the back of the room, listening intently. He didn't interrupt or argue, he simply observed. Watching the chaos unfold gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. Whether people supported him or not, he'd succeeded in doing one thing: forcing the entire neighborhood to confront the absurdity of the HOA's policies. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, of heated discussion, the HOA president tried to regain control. "Let's focus on solutions," she pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. "We can't let this divide us. Let's work together to find a compromise." Evan finally stood up, drawing every eye in the room. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch out. Then, in a calm, measured tone, he began to speak. "I know my proposal sounds extreme," he admitted. "And believe me, I never wanted it to come to this. All I wanted was to build a fence to keep my animals safe and enjoy the land I worked so hard to buy. But instead of working with me, the HOA decided to punish me. They left me no choice but to fight back." He paused, scanning the room. "This isn't about revenge, it's about fairness. If the HOA wants to enforce its rules, then fine, but they need to follow the same standards themselves. And if they won't, well, maybe a little manure will remind them what happens when you push people too far." The room erupted into murmurs, again some angry, others thoughtful. Evan sat back down, satisfied with his performance. He hadn't changed everyone's minds, but he'd planted a seed of doubt. For the first time, many residents began questioning whether the HOA's rigid enforcement of rules truly served the community's best interests. As the meeting adjourned, clusters of neighbors lingered in the parking lot, continuing the conversation. Some approached Evan directly, thanking him for shining a light on the HOA's flaws. Others avoided him altogether, still wary of his unconventional tactics. But one thing was certain: Meadowbrook Estates would never be the same again. The day of the city council hearing arrived, and Meadowbrook Estates buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't just any ordinary meeting, it was a showdown, the kind of event that would be talked about for years to come. Residents poured into the council chambers early, eager to secure a seat. By the time the meeting started, the room was packed, with latecomers standing along the walls or spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity, anger, and nervous energy. This wasn't just about Evan's fence anymore. It was about the soul of Meadowbrook itself. Evan sat at a small table near the front, his papers neatly organized in front of him. He'd spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing his arguments and double-checking every detail of his proposal. Despite the stakes, he felt surprisingly calm. Maybe it was because he knew he'd already won in one sense. He'd forced the entire community to confront issues they'd long ignored. Whatever happened next, he'd made his point loud and clear. The HOA representatives took their seats on the opposite side of the room, looking polished but uneasy. They'd brought reinforcements, lawyers, environmental consultants, and even a public relations specialist who had coached them on how to frame their arguments. Their goal was simple: to shut down Evan's petition before it gained any more traction. But as the meeting unfolded, it became clear that this wouldn't be an easy fight. The chairperson of the city council opened the session with a brief introduction, emphasizing the importance of fairness and civility. Then Evan was called to present his case. Standing up, he walked to the podium, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. For a moment he scanned the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors, the HOA members, and the council officials. Then, in a steady voice, he began to speak. "Let me start by saying this isn't personal," Evan said, leaning slightly forward. "I'm not here to cause trouble or make enemies. I'm here because I believe in fairness, and because I think we can do better as a community." He paused, letting his words sink in. "When I moved to Meadowbrook, I saw potential. I saw wide-open spaces where families could thrive, where kids could play, and where people like me could pursue our dreams. But instead of embracing diversity and creativity, the HOA has chosen to enforce rigid rules that stifle individuality." He went on to explain his situation with the fence, keeping his tone measured but firm. "All I wanted was to protect my animals and enjoy the land I worked so hard to buy. Instead of working with me, the HOA fined me and demanded I tear down my fence. That's when I realized something. If they're going to play hardball, then so am I." Evan shifted gears, turning his focus to the proposal itself. He laid out his argument clearly, citing local zoning laws and explaining how the HOA's common area could legally be rezoned for agricultural use. He emphasized the environmental benefits of proper manure management. pointing out that composting could enrich soil and reduce waste. "This isn't just about revenge," he added. "It's about showing what happens when you push people too far. If the HOA insists on controlling every aspect of our lives, maybe it's time they experience a taste of their own medicine." When Evan finished speaking, the room erupted into murmurs. Some residents nodded approvingly, while others exchanged skeptical glances. The HOA reps looked visibly rattled, whispering urgently among themselves. When it was their turn to respond, they sent their lead attorney to the podium, a tall, sharp-dressed man who exuded confidence. "This proposal is nothing more than a petty act of retaliation," the lawyer declared, his voice booming through the chamber. "It serves no real purpose other than to disrupt our community and harm property values. Let's be honest. No one wants piles of livestock manure in their backyard. That's not progress. It's chaos." He went on to argue that Evans' plan lacked practicality and posed significant risks to public health and safety. What about odors? What about pests? What about the impact on children who use this space? His questions hung in the air, designed to provoke fear and doubt. As he spoke, several residents nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting concern. But Evan wasn't fazed. When given the chance to rebut, he returned to the podium with a calm smile. "Let's address those concerns head-on," he said. "Properly managed manure doesn't smell like raw waste. It breaks down naturally and can even become odorless compost. And as for pests, there are proven techniques to minimize risks. I'm not proposing we dump raw manure in the middle of the lot. I'm talking about responsible, sustainable practices." He turned to face the audience, his expression earnest. "Look, I get it. Livestock manure isn't glamorous. No one's going to put it on a postcard or brag about it at dinner parties. But neither is being bullied by an organization that refuses to listen. If the HOA wants to avoid this outcome, all they have to do is show some flexibility. Compromise isn't weakness, it's strength." As the debate continued, the council members asked tough questions, probing both sides for answers. They wanted to know about feasibility, costs, and long-term impacts. Evan handled each question with clarity and patience while the HOA reps grew increasingly defensive. By the end of the presentations, it was clear that public opinion was shifting. Many residents who had initially opposed Evan's idea now seemed to view it as a wake-up call, a dramatic but necessary step to challenge the HOA's dominance. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the council announced their decision. They approved Evan's petition, but with conditions. The rezoning would only last temporarily, giving both sides time to negotiate a resolution. In exchange, Evan agreed to modify his fence slightly to meet aesthetic standards, though he retained its core functionality. It was a compromise, messy but effective, and it left everyone with plenty to think about. As the crowd dispersed, Evan lingered outside the building, shaking hands and exchanging smiles with neighbors who approached him. Some thanked him for standing up to the HOA, while others admitted they still weren't thrilled about the idea of manure storage. But regardless of where they stood, one thing was undeniable. Evan had sparked a change. Meadowbrook Estates might never look at its rules, or its leaders, the same way again. In the weeks that followed the City Council's decision, Meadowbrook Estates felt different. It wasn't just the lingering buzz about Evan's audacious move or the temporary rezoning of the HOA's common area. It was something deeper. The community had been shaken out of its complacency, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, fairness, and what it meant to live together as neighbors. For years, people had grumbled quietly about the HOA's strict rules, but rarely dared to speak up. Now, thanks to Evan, those whispers turned into conversations, sometimes heated, sometimes hopeful, but always honest. Evan himself became a reluctant celebrity of sorts. Neighbors stopped him at the grocery store to chat, asking how he'd managed to take on the HOA and win. Some treated him like a hero, while others still eyed him warily, unsure whether to admire his boldness or worry about what might come next. But Evan didn't let the attention go to his head. He stayed grounded, focusing on his ranch and the life he'd envisioned when he first moved to Meadowbrook. Still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not because he'd won, but because he'd sparked something bigger than himself. The HOA, meanwhile, found itself in an awkward position. Their carefully crafted image of authority and control had cracked, exposing vulnerabilities they hadn't realized existed. At first, they tried to downplay the situation, issuing vague statements about working toward solutions. But behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Board members argued over who was to blame for letting things escalate so far. Had they been too rigid with Evan? Could they have handled the fence issue differently? These questions lingered, unresolved as they scrambled to regain trust within the community. One of their first steps was to hold another town hall meeting, not to defend themselves, but to listen. This time, instead of dictating rules, they invited residents to share their thoughts openly. Chairs were arranged in a circle to encourage dialogue, and snacks were laid out to create a friendlier atmosphere. It was a small gesture, but it signaled a shift in tone. People showed up cautiously, unsure what to expect. Some came ready to vent, while others simply wanted answers. When the meeting began, the HOA president took the floor, her voice softer than usual. "We know we haven't always gotten things right," she admitted, glancing around the room. "And we're sorry for that. We want to hear from you, really hear you, so we can do better moving forward." Her words hung in the air, met with a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. Residents didn't hold back. One man stood up, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "You fined me last year for painting my front door blue," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Blue? Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? My kids helped me paint it, and instead of appreciating the effort, you made us feel like criminals." Another neighbor chimed in, her arms crossed tightly. "What about the tree in my backyard? I got a warning for trimming it without permission. It was dying, for heaven's sake. Are we supposed to wait for approval every time we sneeze?" The floodgates opened and story after story poured out, each one highlighting the frustrations people had bottled up for years. The HOA reps listened, intently nodding and taking notes. They didn't interrupt or argue, they simply let the community speak. By the end of the night, it was clear that change was needed, and not just cosmetic changes either. Real, meaningful reform. Over the following months, the HOA began implementing new policies. They formed committees to review existing rules, eliminating outdated ones and revising others to make them more flexible. They also introduced a feedback system, allowing residents to voice concerns before decisions were finalized. Slowly but surely, the balance of power shifted. The HOA no longer acted as an all-knowing overseer. Instead, they positioned themselves as partners in creating a thriving neighborhood. For Evan, the compromise worked out better than he'd expected. With minor adjustments to his fence, he avoided further fines, and the threat of manure storage faded away. But the real victory wasn't in the details. It was in the ripple effect his actions had created. Meadowbrook Estates wasn't perfect, but it was evolving. Residents started seeing each other less as adversaries and more as collaborators. Community events drew larger crowds, and discussions about shared goals replaced arguments over trivial disputes. As spring rolled around, Evan stood on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, silhouetted against the golden sky. He thought about everything that had happened, the battles fought, the lessons learned, and the friendships forged along the way. Sure, he'd taken risks, and not everyone agreed with his methods, but deep down he knew he'd done the right thing. Meadowbrook wasn't just a place anymore, it was a community. And Evan Carter, the quiet rebel with a love for wide-open spaces, had played a pivotal role in shaping its future. As he sipped his coffee and listened to the distant chirping of crickets, he smiled to himself. Life here wasn't always easy, but it was worth fighting for.